On December 2nd, 1993, in one of the hotels in Bogotá, the capital of Colombia, a telephone rang. And in that part of the world, it may have been the most important call of the entire decade. It was a call people had been waiting for, truly waiting for. A Colombian army general was waiting for it. A group of federal agents were waiting for it. CIA consultants were waiting for it. And somewhere in that hotel room, sitting beside two children, a son and a daughter, a frightened woman was waiting for it, without even fully realizing why. When she finally picked up the phone, she heard her husband's voice. And the man on the other end of the line was the head of the most powerful criminal organization South America had ever seen in the 20th century. A man who was standing alone against two governments at the same time, Colombia and the United States. The number one target for everyone in the country who wore a uniform. The moment the call connected, surveillance systems were activated, and the line was instantly tapped. Now there was only one question that mattered. Would he stay on the phone long enough for them to trace him? Hello, friends. Today we're talking about one of the most legendary drug traffickers in history, one of the main anti-heroes of the second half of the 20th century, Pablo Escobar and the Medellín Cartel. Pablo Escobar, the main character of this story, was born on December 1st, 1949, into a fairly modest family, a farmer for a father and a school teacher for a mother. And like any normal child, he dreamed about a future where he wouldn't have to dig potatoes for the rest of his life like his dad. What exactly he wanted to become is impossible to say for sure. Maybe a footballer, maybe even a president. Who really knows what Colombian boys were dreaming about back then? What we do know is what he later admitted himself. As a child, he dreamed of making 1,000,000 pesos and never needing anything again. But in Colombia of the 1950s, for a boy growing up on the outskirts of Medellín, there were practically no real chances for a bright future. The country was, in reality, economically dependent on the United States, and all the big money in Colombia was controlled by American corporations, like the infamous United Fruit. Long story short, workers were paid almost nothing, and if they complained, they weren't negotiating with managers anymore. The army handled labor relations. Trying to build a political career wasn't much safer either. You could simply get killed. Politics in Colombia had always been sharp, dangerous, and tightly connected to criminal clans and guerrilla groups. And young Escobar, most likely he did what every other kid on his block did. He played football in the street. But he also understood something very clearly. No one was ever going to invite him to the national team. For a street kid like him, there were other ways to make a name and make money. Rougher, dirtier, but much more realistic. First money, cemeteries, counterfeits, and weed. Pablo made his first money the same way a lot of kids from his neighborhood did. He would walk through cemeteries looking for graves no one visited anymore, steal the tombstones, and sell the stone to resellers. Later, he moved on to selling counterfeit goods in the streets, cigarettes, fake lottery tickets, and of course, marijuana. From the outside, it sounds absurd, like a routine from another universe. You wake up, have breakfast, steal a tombstone, and spend the afternoon selling weed. But in Colombia of the 1960s, this was almost normal life, and the risk was low. Police didn't really chase you, because they were usually getting their cut. And for a teenager, that meant two things: some money in his pocket and a growing reputation among other boys in the streets. Escobar quickly became known as sharp, fearless, and dangerous. His parents were, to put it mildly, unhappy. But from their point of view, life was nothing but scraping by. Endless, boring work for almost nothing. While their son lived like a pirate. Danger, risk, loot, and a name people whispered with respect. By the late 1960s, Escobar had gathered around him a crew of the same wild and hungry young men and found himself a protector, a local crime boss named Álvaro Prieto. This was no street kid anymore. This was serious business. Prieto was involved in smuggling and moved large shipments of marijuana across the border. At the same time, he kept control of his territory and constantly looked for promising young criminals. And that's exactly how he noticed Escobar and his crew and took them under his wing. From that moment on, Pablo's gang wasn't just selling weed anymore. They were doing extortion. They controlled local shops. They hunted for expensive cars and blackmailed the owners. Pay us or your car disappears, gets stripped for parts, and sold piece by piece. And if someone refused, that's exactly what happened. Prieto had special workshops where stolen vehicles were dismantled. There's even a story that during small raids, Pablo and his people used mopeds painted in two colors, red on one side and black on the other, specifically to confuse the police when they were being chased. In 1971, Pablo Escobar was only 22 when he committed his first murder. On the orders of Álvaro Prieto, Escobar's gang kidnapped a wealthy industrialist named Diego Echevarria, a man hated by the poor districts of Medellín. Rich, cruel, living in a beautiful house and paying his workers almost nothing, he was everything the slums despised about the elite. He was 76 years old when Escobar forced him to call his family and demand a ransom. Bring the money and the old man walks free. But he refused, completely. He would not beg. He would not negotiate. Pablo began torturing him and went too far. The man died from suffocation. When they realized he was dead, they dumped his body in the street. No ransom, no payment, no success. Prieto was furious. Escobar promised he would do better next time. But something unexpected happened. On the streets, Pablo hadn't failed. He had become a legend. In the mythology of Medellín's poor neighborhoods, killing a rich man wasn't a crime. It was a heroic act. And that's where the story of Colombian justice really begins, where violence starts to look like fairness and murder starts to feel like revenge. Around the same time, people started calling Escobar El Doctor. No one really knows why. Maybe because he was said to be curing the neighborhood by removing unwanted people. Maybe because he understood drugs better than anyone. Or maybe because of the way he tortured his victims with the same cold precision people associated with the infamous Dr. Mengele. The truth is probably a mix of all three. But to understand why a nickname like that could even exist, you have to understand what Colombia looked like at that moment. One thing is selling fake cigarettes in the street, but kidnapping respected businessmen and doing it openly, almost without hiding, that's on another level. Was the police really so indifferent? The answer is even worse than that. Crime in Colombia had reached such insane levels that kidnappings became routine, everyday life, like traffic jams. According to official statistics from that period, around 10 people disappeared every single day. Criminal gangs kidnapped people for ransom. Guerrilla and Marxist groups kidnapped for political leverage. Gangs kidnapped each other during turf wars. At some point, a special type of kidnapping even appeared: express kidnappings. No planning, no long surveillance. You see a well-dressed man or a tourist with money, you grab him, throw him into a car, drive him to his family, demand cash, and then usually let him go. That was Colombia, a country where kidnapping became normal. And that system, in many places, still hasn't disappeared. Under Prieto's protection, Escobar climbed fast. He took part in kidnappings, helped move marijuana across borders, and at that time, marijuana was the main source of criminal income. But then Pablo changed the rules of how he got paid. Instead of taking a fee for each job, he demanded a percentage of the group's total income. And that changed everything. Even back then, the money became serious. As a kid, he dreamed of earning 1 million pesos, and now, according to different biographers, by the age of 25, his fortune was already being measured in tens of millions. At 25, he was a multimillionaire, and normally, that should have been enough. But when you're young, rich, and already famous in the criminal world, you don't want to stop. You don't want comfort, you want immortality. You want to become a legend. At that time, Colombia wasn't even the main player in the global drug trade. And if we were making an unofficial ranking of narco states, Cuba would have taken first place because it sat right next to the United States, had a pro-American government, and for years American, mostly Italian, organized crime operated there openly, running casinos, brothels, plantations, and smuggling routes. And as long as Cuba existed in that role, Colombia remained in the shadow. But everything changed at the end of the 1950s, when the Cuban Revolution happened. Fidel Castro came to power. The United States imposed a full blockade on the island, and overnight Cuba disappeared from the drug map as if it had never existed. The routes were cut, the channels collapsed, the entire system broke down, and a massive vacuum appeared in the global drug market. And as always, a vacuum does not stay empty for long, because that space was quickly filled by people in Colombia. First, smugglers like Álvaro Prieto, and then a new generation of criminals like Pablo Escobar. And that is the exact moment when the center of the drug trade began to shift south, and the future narco empire quietly changed its address from Havana to Medellín. In the 1970s, a new drug entered the market: cocaine. And it was insanely profitable, so Escobar decided to step into the game. and at that point, he already knew all the right people. The only thing missing was the product itself, because there were no coca plantations in Colombia yet. So he bought raw material in neighboring Ecuador, about 20 kilograms of cocaine paste, and brought it to Medellín to local chemists to turn the paste into powder, planning to resell it to another smuggler for several times the price. And it could have been a perfect deal and the beginning of a fortune, but it was exactly this operation that got Escobar arrested by the police, and essentially, one of his first serious drug deals almost became his very last. What followed looked almost mystical. First, Escobar tried to bribe the judge, but the judge turned out to be a rare thing in that world, a man with principles. Then it was announced that 2 police officers who had caught Escobar with the cocaine paste would testify in court. And before the hearing could even begin, both officers were publicly gunned down in broad daylight. What happened next was never fully uncovered, but the result was very clear. Escobar and his partners were released, and the case quietly disappeared. It was possibly the first moment when Pablo Escobar's most famous rule revealed itself in full force. The rule he called Plata o Plomo, silver or lead, take the money or take the bullet. That rule would define his entire life. One photograph remains from that first serious case. Escobar, standing inside a police station, holding his number plaque, smiling from ear to ear. Let's be honest, he doesn't look like a man who just survived prison. He looks like a man who understands exactly what kind of game he's just entered. For a while after that, the police practically stopped bothering him. His couriers quietly brought cocaine paste from Ecuador, Medellín chemists turned it into powder, and the final product was handed over to smugglers. And the system worked. For 2 years straight, no trouble, no resistance, just money. And then Escobar decided it wasn't enough to just be one of many. He wanted the entire drug market in the region. And to do that, he had to unite the strong and erase the weak. Pablo personally sat down with the most powerful traffickers in Medellín and formed an alliance that would become legendary. There were 5 of them. 3 were the Ochoa brothers, his childhood friends. Another was his cousin Gustavo Gaviria, the man who would later become Escobar's right hand and financial brain. And the 5th was a man named José Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha, known as El Mexicano, the Mexican. Gacha came from almost the same background as Escobar, the son of poor farmers. But while Pablo moved through street crime and smuggling, El Mexicano went straight into being a hitman. In the 1970s, he made his name in Bogotá by joining one gang and systematically wiping out the entire family of a rival group's leader. The nickname El Mexicano came from his obsession with Mexican narco music, slang, and culture. Spanish, yes, but a completely different flavor. He turned himself into a brand, and he became famous for a few things. First, after becoming rich, he bought one of Colombia's top football clubs and made its unofficial anthem a Mexican narco corrido, played by musicians brought in specifically before every home match. Second, he built one of the largest cocaine laboratories in the country, deep inside the jungle. Not just a lab, but an entire secret city with nearly 2,000 workers processing drugs around the clock. And while you were maybe a year old, in 1976, these men were already building an empire. That was the moment the Medellín Cartel was born. First, they took over the region. Then they monopolized cocaine shipments from Colombia into the United States. And from that point on, the drug business stopped being a business. It became an industry. If you wanted to sell cocaine, you came to Medellín and you dealt with them. If you wanted to go around them, you could try. But you had to understand one thing. Every kilogram that reached the United States without the cartel meant money taken straight out of the cartel's pocket. And the cartel did not forgive that. From the very beginning, their tax was simple and brutal. 35% for their services. If you wanted to operate, you paid 1/3 of your income to Escobar's people. And in return, you got one thing that actually mattered, a guarantee that your product would reach the United States. The details of how it traveled, we'll talk about that later. But in this business, that guarantee was everything. Yes, 35% sounds insane by any business standard. But in this world, the cartel controlled what was practically the only safe route. Of course, some groups refused to pay, and they always fell into 2 categories. Those who sold very little and very rarely, so small they didn't show up on the radar, and the dead. Once the cartel became powerful, the second category became the main one. The rule of Plata o Plomo, applied to everyone. If you were brave, useful, or wore a uniform, you were welcome. The cartel paid well. If you interfered, you were killed. There are no official numbers, but in the cartel's early years, thousands of people were sent to their graves, mostly rival gang members, but also policemen and government officials. It got to the point of absurdity. In the early 1980s, whenever even some small-time criminal disappeared, rumors would spread instantly. He crossed Escobar. In the criminal mindset of Colombia at that time, Escobar wasn't just a man anymore. He was an all-seeing eye, a brutal god. Now let's talk about how the cartel actually worked and how its operations were built. By the 1980s, the Medellín Cartel controlled up to 80% of all cocaine entering the United States. They were no longer buying raw material in Ecuador. By that time, the cartel already had its own coca plantations and a network of chemical laboratories across Colombia. And Escobar himself was barely over 30 years old, obscenely rich, politically untouchable, and most importantly, extremely rational. He didn't stack money under mattresses. He reinvested it. He built infrastructure. He turned crime into engineering. And the smartest investment of all became a small island in the Bahamas called Norman's Key. Geographically, it was perfect, close to the US coast, right next to Florida. And that island became the central corridor for moving cocaine from Colombia into America. It wasn't just a base, it was a fortress. And at the same time, a pirate haven straight out of an 18th century adventure novel. Armed guards everywhere, radar, machine gun towers, armored boats circling the island day and night. And then, there are the memories of one of the pilots who flew for the cartel. The island was a playground, he said. I still remember landing and seeing naked girls waiting for me in a Land Rover with the top down. And the parties, it was Sodom and Gomorrah. Drugs, sex, no police, no rules. It was fun. And that, in one line, explains everything. The Medellín Cartel didn't just build a business, they built a world. The entire air operation through Norman's Cay was built by two men, Carlos Lehder, nicknamed the German, and George Young. And their partnership started in the most logical place imaginable, a prison cell. Lehder was born in Colombia to a German engineer. His parents split early, and he slid into crime fast, stealing cars, selling weed, hustling across borders, until he eventually got busted on drug charges and sent to prison in the United States. And that's where fate dropped him into the same cell as George Young. Young was an American college guy. Back in the States, he sold marijuana, then realized he'd make real money if he cut out the middlemen and went straight to the source. So he flew to Mexico, met traffickers, started running product himself, made enough cash to buy several light aircraft and hire pilots, and eventually got arrested with another shipment. Now imagine the two of them sitting in a cell, talking about a new miracle drug that was taking over America, cocaine. Powder takes up almost no space compared to bales of weed, which means you can move more. It costs way more, which means you earn way more. Young had contacts in the US who could receive shipments and move product on the streets. Lehder had ties in Colombia. He knew who actually controlled supply, the people behind the Medellín Cartel. Young got released first, in 1976. Lehder followed in 1977. And instead of going home to start a normal life, they went to the beach and started recruiting American tourists. Girls in bikinis, easy targets. Listen, they'd say. We give you a package, you take it to the US, our people meet you, and you make stupid money. The girls agreed. In the late 70s, passengers weren't searched like today, but if they had been caught, they'd have faced life in prison. The two of them ran enough of these trips to buy small planes of their own, and then they went all in. They walked straight to Pablo Escobar himself and offered him a streamlined, scalable air corridor into the United States. Escobar said yes, and just like that, the Medellín Cartel got wings. So what did a normal shipment actually look like? In Colombia, cocaine was loaded into light, single-engine planes, the kind that could take off from almost any flat dirt strip. The planes flew to Norman's Cay, refueled, then headed out again, flying low to stay off radar, crossed into Florida, dropped the cargo near Miami, and turned right back around. And then everyone celebrated. On average, and really think about this, around 2 tons of cocaine a week were being pushed into the United States through one tiny island. There are estimates that at the peak of its power, the cartel was earning up to $60 million a day. Not a year, a day. That kind of money doesn't just make you rich, it makes you untouchable. The structure of the cartel looked like a strange hybrid, part government, part corporation. There was a boss, basically the president of the company, and under him, various deputies, like ministers of different departments, agriculture, logistics, security, and essentially a minister of assassination. Below them were department heads, and every department did one job, and only one job. One grew, another processed, the third transported, the fourth managed people, the fifth moved money, and so on. At its peak, the Medellín Cartel wasn't a gang. It was a massive enterprise with hundreds, more likely thousands of people on the payroll, all locked into their roles like employees in a multinational corporation. There was even a full-blown intelligence network operating inside Colombia and abroad. The cartel hired foreign professionals, retired British, Israeli, even Cuban military specialists, men who trained cartel enforcers in real combat tactics, like some private underground army. And by that point, Escobar wasn't just running a criminal business anymore. He was running a shadow state. On the ground, the cartel was built as a network of cells. A cell usually meant one family or one village. On the plantations, you worked with your neighbors, your cousins, people you had known your whole life. And this system worked perfectly against theft and betrayal, because everyone knew that if you tried to hide something or talk to the police, your entire family would suffer for it. Second, the cells were designed to be as decentralized as possible. A farmer harvesting coca only knew that a truck driver would arrive. The driver only knew where to pick up the load and where to deliver it. The chemist knew when the shipment would arrive, nothing else. Everyone had exactly one piece of the puzzle. If law enforcement managed to plant an informant inside a cell, that person only learned about that one unit. And if necessary, that unit could simply be cut off from the rest of the operation without damaging the entire network. The separate cells were connected by coordinators, but breaking one of them in interrogation was almost impossible. It was smarter to take 25 years in prison than to betray anyone. If he stayed silent, the cartel would support his family financially and make sure his prison life was as comfortable as possible. But if he talked, he would die, his family would die, and it wouldn't be quick or clean. Everyone knew that. Beyond drugs, the Medellín Cartel was running another operation with the same level of precision: image control. From a very young age, Pablo understood one simple truth: if the people love you, they will never betray you to the police. They'll do the opposite: mislead the cops, hide you, send them in the wrong direction. So when the real money started coming in, Escobar didn't just invest in business. He invested in his legend. With cartel money, Medellín suddenly got new roads, hospitals, schools, football fields, stadiums. Sports clubs appeared, youth teams were funded. Entire neighborhoods were built where slums used to stand. For kids from the outskirts, real life suddenly became possible. Education, healthcare, something to live for. Escobar even had a special team whose entire job was to search for what we'd now call PR opportunities. Families and stories that would boost his reputation the most. A mother loses her son to illness? Escobar suddenly appears and pays for the operation. A poor family has nowhere to live? They wake up one day with a home. There were not 5 or 10 of these stories. There were hundreds. Naturally, people talked, and the story became simple. Who is Escobar? Our protector, our patron, the only man who actually cares about us. Pablo didn't forget about himself either. People don't usually get into industrial-scale drug trafficking to quietly save for retirement. They do it to light their mornings with $100 bills. Modesty is not exactly a core value among Latin American drug lords, and minimalism is a concept they've never heard of. Escobar was no exception. He lived large, extremely large. Outside Medellín, he built himself a private kingdom, Hacienda Nápoles, roughly 20 square kilometers of pure excess. It had everything a successful narco boss could possibly want: a colonial-style mansion, panic rooms, and cash vaults. People claimed he spent over $1,000 a month just on rubber bands for packing money. A gigantic garage full of vintage cars. A private brothel with girls on duty 24/7. A private airstrip. A monument to a Piper Super Cub plane as a personal symbol of success. And even his own Formula One-style racetrack. Basically, every teenage fantasy, realized in real life. The entire estate reportedly cost him around $2 million, which, for Escobar, was loose change. And yes, there was a private zoo. Lions, tigers, giraffes, and most famously, hippos. After Escobar's death, nobody really knew what to do with the animals. The hippos were simply released from the property and left alone. They wandered into nearby swamps and multiplied fast. It turned out the Colombian climate was perfect for them, and there were no natural predators capable of stopping an adult hippo. Today, there are hundreds of Escobar's hippos roaming the countryside. They damage ecosystems, threaten local wildlife, and from time to time, scare the hell out of farmers. A hippo can easily kill a man if it wants to. So without even realizing it, Pablo Escobar didn't just reshape Colombia's economy. He reshaped its ecosystem too. Like any proper Latin American man, Pablo Escobar saw himself as a family man. A ton of cocaine was just business, but God and mother were sacred. That's how he liked to present himself. In 1976, at the age of 26, Escobar got married. His bride was 15 years old. Her name was Maria Victoria Henao Vallejo. They had met earlier, when Pablo was 23 and she was just 12. Her family naturally was against the marriage, but interestingly, it wasn't the age gap that bothered them the most. What really scared them was something else. Pablo was just a slum gangster, no status, no name, a terrible match. So Escobar solved the problem the way gangsters solve problems. He kidnapped his own bride, with her consent. The very next day they were married in a church. Pablo reportedly told her, "Now, my love, we are together forever." A romantic story. At least that's how it looked to Maria Victoria back then. Years later, she would admit that Pablo had been preparing her for the role of his wife since she was 12. To Escobar, marriage wasn't a joke. A year before the wedding, in 1975, he had already launched his own operations and seriously expanded his business. Now, as he liked to say, he had a family to feed. But very quickly, the young wife realized that living with a drug lord didn't look like a TV series at all. There was no dream mansion yet. During the day, she went to school. In the evenings, she cleaned, cooked, washed clothes. Pablo, meanwhile, was at work. At least that's what he said. Everyone around her knew. They'd spot him in restaurants with other women. Then again, somewhere else. Then again. Maria Victoria showed remarkable endurance for someone her age. She decided that affairs were no reason to leave a husband. In Latin America at the time, men were believed to be all the same. And Pablo, she told herself, was no different from the rest. If you want, send the next section. I'll keep translating and styling it in the same format. Next came the children. Their first child was born in 1977, under almost cinematic circumstances. Maria Victoria actually went into labor during her English exam and barely made it to the hospital in time. And here's the thing, in this one area, Escobar didn't lie. Despite dozens of affairs, his wife and children really were his priority. His son Juan later recalled one unforgettable episode. During another massive police operation, the family fled into the mountains and hid in a small shack. It was freezing. The children were shaking with cold. So Escobar spent the entire night feeding a fire with banknotes. According to Juan, Pablo burned about $2 million just to keep his kids warm. He was also close with his relatives. Pablo's older brother, Roberto Gaviria, was known by the nickname El Osito, the little bear, or teddy bear. He was effectively a co-founder of the Medellín Cartel, and Escobar trusted him with the money. After the cartel collapsed, El Osito spent 10 years in prison. Even there, someone tried to kill him. A small explosive device was mailed into his cell. Roberto survived, but lost an eye. When he got out, he didn't return to crime. But he never lost his taste for spectacle. In 2016, he tried to register the rights to his brother's image and filed a billion-dollar lawsuit against Netflix, right as the series Narcos was coming out. In 2019, he accused Elon Musk of stealing the idea of selling flamethrowers as merchandise. The same year, he raised money to impeach Donald Trump, and unbelievably collected about $10 million. Riding on what he calls the Escobar brand, he even launched his own cryptocurrency, Escobar Coin. The project failed. Roberto wasn't discouraged. He's still alive today, pushing 80, giving interviews, and calmly insisting on one incredible thing, that his brother, of all things, absolutely hated cocaine. Send the next section whenever you're ready. I'll keep going in the same style. Let's get back to Pablo. At some point, Medellín just wasn't enough for him anymore. He had enormous power, enormous money, and enormous ambition. Being a local legend no longer satisfied him. He wanted to become a national hero, maybe even take power in the country for real, officially. So he tried to move into the capital. But Bogotá met him cold. In Medellín, he was the king. In Bogotá, he was nobody. A gangster, a thug from the provinces. The authorities in the capital at least tried to fight the drug trade, but their success was, let's put it gently, unimpressive. They threw massive forces at the problem and got almost nothing in return. Worse, information about police operations often ended up on Escobar's desk before the raids even started. Plata o Plomo worked perfectly. Some cops he simply bought and put on payroll. The honest ones, the stubborn ones, the cartel dealt with in more creative ways. Quietly, ruthlessly, in ways that couldn't be traced directly back to Pablo. In the end, everyone knew what was happening. Everyone understood it, and nobody could stop him. In his war against the state, Escobar was winning, without breaking a sweat. In 1982, Pablo decided it was time to stop fighting the state and become the state. And he stepped into legal politics, running for office and, without much resistance, securing a seat as an alternate congressman in Colombia's parliament, completing all the formal procedures and suddenly finding himself inside the government system he had spent years corrupting from the outside. First, he gained parliamentary immunity, and second, doors opened everywhere. Official invitations started arriving, and at one point, he even represented Colombia at the inauguration of Spain's prime minister as part of the traditional diplomatic protocol between Spain and its former colonies. But that wasn't the real goal at all, because everyone around him understood what he was truly aiming for: the presidency. And even a country as dysfunctional as Colombia could not allow that, because sometimes even a state like this remembers that it still wants to be the biggest cartel in the room and does not tolerate competitors at the very top. The first men to openly confront Escobar were presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán and Minister of Justice Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, and they launched a public campaign to tear apart his image, trying to show the country that this wasn't a generous benefactor or a patriotic businessman, but a full-scale criminal and a murderer. And for once, money didn't fix the problem, because despite the bribes and pressure, Escobar could not hold on to his seat, and in 1984 was forced out of politics after Lara presented the full case against him in Congress. And then, 3 months later, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was dead when two men on a motorcycle pulled up next to his car in traffic and executed him point blank with automatic rifles. And that was Escobar's message. Politics, just like business, could still be solved the same way, with bullets. That assassination became the final trigger, and the Colombian president declared open war on the drug cartels and promised the nation that everyone would be hunted down, that no one would hide forever. And Escobar answered with terror. By the mid-1980s, even if the Medellín Cartel did not fully control Colombia, it had reached into every corner of the country. And for every arrest the state made, the cartel replied with the murder of police officers, with Escobar openly putting a price on a cop's head and turning uniformed men into walking targets, while every discovered coca plantation was followed by a bombing or the execution of a high-ranking official, until newspapers were filled with obituaries and daily body counts, and the streets of entire cities began to feel like front lines. Because this was no longer crime in the shadows. This was a real war, with bombs, assassinations, fear, and a population trapped between a government that had finally decided to fight and a cartel that had decided to burn the country rather than lose it. In 1985, Escobar made a move that sounded insane, but worked. He hired the fighters of the far-left guerrilla group M19 to storm the Supreme Court building in Bogotá, and officially, they had nothing to do with the Medellín Cartel. But unofficially, during the chaos of the attack, they destroyed every single document connected to the extradition of cartel bosses to the United States. The government responded by retaking the courthouse with tanks, and by that moment, the US had, to put it mildly, very serious questions for Pablo Escobar. The Reagan administration demanded that Colombia arrest cartel members according to American lists and hand them over, where there would be no comfortable prison, no deals, and no negotiating. But demanding is one thing, and enforcing is another. Colombian authorities hesitated. One day they signed extradition agreements, the next they quietly walked them back. Part of it was diplomacy, part of it was fear, and part of it was Escobar's money. He bought politicians, he bought lobbyists, he bought time. Still, the pressure kept growing. In 1987, the Colombian president vetoed a court ruling that had banned extradition, and for the first time, the state crossed the line it had avoided for years. One of Escobar's closest partners, the German, Carlos Lehder, was handed over to the United States and sentenced to life in prison, plus another 135 years. Years later, rumors would circulate that he was released on medical grounds, that he returned to Germany, and even that he donated money to charity. Whether that last part is true or not, the message to Escobar was unmistakable. The wall was closing in. Escobar answered the approval of extradition with total terror. The cartel created a group called Los Extraditables, those who are extradited. And in reality, it was a radical terrorist network. For every arrest, for every major operation, they responded with blood. Their slogan was simple and brutal: better a grave in Colombia than a prison in America. Assassinations followed one after another. Presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán was murdered. Supreme Court Justice Carlos Valencia was killed. Police Colonel Valdemar Franco Canto was executed. And they were only the most famous names on a very long list. In the 2 weeks leading up to the 1989 presidential election, the cartel carried out 7 bombings, killing more than 40 people. And in November of that same year, they crossed into pure horror. A passenger Boeing 727 was blown up in midair, with over 100 people on board. By then, Colombia was no longer just fighting drug trafficking. It was surviving a war of terror. This tragedy shows the true scale of the cartel's cruelty. The flight was a domestic one, from Bogotá to Cali. 2 well-dressed men boarded the plane, one of them carrying a suitcase. Later, it would turn out that the suitcase was full of explosives. They took 2 seats in row 18, directly above the fuel tanks. Just before takeoff, one of the men got up and calmly walked out. The other stayed behind and died with everyone else on board. Why he stayed is still unknown. Why was the bombing even necessary? There are 2 main versions. One says that an aide to the murdered presidential candidate Galán was supposed to be on that flight. The other claims that a former member of the Medellín Cartel, who had turned police informant, was on board. Either way, to execute one man, the cartel did not hesitate to sacrifice 109 innocent passengers. When the bomb went off, the aircraft was literally torn apart in midair. On December 6, 1989, the cartel attempted to assassinate the head of Colombia's secret police. The bomb killed 62 people. The government struck back by destroying labs and burning coca plantations across the country. Later that same month, special forces tracked down El Mexicano. He fought back and died in a shootout during the raid. In 1990, authorities found Escobar's cousin and closest partner, Gustavo Gaviria. He was killed as well while resisting arrest. Around the same time, the Ochoa clan walked away from the Medellín Cartel almost entirely. By then, the whole thing looked like a meat grinder with the handle being cranked from both sides. But in wars like this, one side eventually runs out of strength. And this time, it wasn't Escobar. The cartel found a way to escape the situation as a winner. They began kidnapping relatives of wealthy businessmen and government officials in bulk, forcing families to pressure the authorities. Once again, Colombia imposed a moratorium on extraditing cartel members to the United States. At the same time, Escobar offered the state a deal so cynical it almost sounded brilliant. He would surrender, but only on the condition that he would never be sent to America. Under massive public pressure and the terror of the kidnappings, the government agreed. Of course, the cartel boss had no intention of serving time like an ordinary prisoner. A special prison was built just for him, La Catedral, literally, the cathedral. Escobar personally selected the guards and ordered the place to be equipped with jacuzzis, a football field, several bars, and even a waterfall. The message was simple: either he sits in luxury or blood continues to run in the streets. His sentence came with freedom as well. He could leave the prison when he wanted, return when he wanted, and run his business from inside. But the cartel's operations were already falling apart. Several partners decided to skim his share from certain deals. Escobar had them kidnapped, brought to La Catedral, and personally tortured. It's known he drilled into their knees. When the Colombian president found out, that was the final straw. On July 22, 1992, an order was given to remove Escobar from his luxury prison and transfer him to a real one. But when the troops arrived at La Catedral, there was no one left to move. The prison was empty. The war between the Medellín Cartel and the state turned into a war of exhaustion. and in the long run, the state machine proved stronger. The army destroyed laboratories, burned coca fields, and broke supply routes. Inside the cartel, mutiny was growing. Nobody wanted to stay on the losing side. The pressure only increased when the Cali cartel entered the game. They began hunting Escobar directly, in coordination with the CIA. Pablo's people were either bribed or killed, and the circle around him tightened day by day. At the same time, the CIA reached out to far-right paramilitary groups and helped create a new force, Los Pepes. The name stood for Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. Though in reality, it was mostly just hired gunmen. And Los Pepes did what the police could not. They dismantled Escobar's world piece by piece, burning his houses, killing anyone even loosely connected to the cartel, wiping out his network through raw violence. The Medellín Cartel empire was collapsing, attacked from every side. And sooner or later, one thing became clear. Escobar had overestimated his power, and now stood alone against the entire world. There's a popular myth that at this point, Escobar offered the government a new bargain, that he was ready to use cartel money to pay off Colombia's entire national debt, around $20 billion, in exchange for being left alone. But the state was done making deals. Nothing could buy him peace anymore. So Pablo tried at least to save his family. If his wife and children were safe, the government and the CIA would lose their strongest leverage. He put them on a private plane and sent them to Germany. But just before landing, the aircraft was turned around at the request of the US government and forced to return to Colombia. His family was placed in hotels under constant surveillance. Meanwhile, Escobar himself went underground, moving from place to place, keeping phone calls painfully short so they couldn't be traced. The money was gone. The power was gone. The market was already slipping away into the hands of the Cali cartel, which operated quietly, carefully, and almost freely. All the government wanted now was Escobar. All it wanted was a public ending. Everything else mattered far less. And then came December 2nd, 1993. Escobar finally called his family at the hotel. He hadn't seen them in over a year. He spoke with his son for about 5 minutes, and that was enough. The call was traced. Within minutes, special forces surrounded the house he was calling from. The assault began almost immediately. Pablo had no intention of surrendering. Gunfire erupted inside the building. At one point, the drug lord broke out onto the roof. A sniper hit him first in the leg, then in the back. What happened next is still disputed. According to one version, a sniper walked up and finished him with a shot to the head. According to another, Escobar pulled the trigger himself. Years later, his son recalled something his father used to say: "If they ever corner me, I'll kill myself. I will never let them take me alive." Escobar's death, of course, did not end Colombia's cocaine trade. The market was simply taken over by the Cali cartel. They followed the same rule, Plata o Plomo, but preferred to solve problems quietly, with silver rather than lead. Escobar's story proved one thing very clearly. The kind of fame that turns you into a legend is the same kind of fame that eventually kills you. Today, Medellín is one of Colombia's biggest tourist destinations. Escobar's face is everywhere, on t-shirts, mugs, keychains. For $15 or $20, you can take a tour of his battle history, where he grew up, where he ran his early operations, where he sold weed, and so on. And at some point, the guide will fold his hands almost like in prayer and say, "Pablo was a saint. Without him, we wouldn't have survived those years." La Catedral, Escobar's luxury prison, stood abandoned for years after his escape. Then in 2007, Benedictine monks moved in. They turned it into a memorial for victims of the Medellín cartel and a retirement home. His mansion became state property and later a tourist site. Only one problem remained: the Hippos. And strangely enough, the Hippos were luckier than Escobar himself. No one hunted them down. They were simply released. They spread across nearby rivers and wetlands and felt perfectly at home. So that's the story of Pablo Escobar, more or less. But one crucial piece is still missing: the money. What happened to Escobar's fortune, how it was traced, and how that investigation eventually exposed the main bank that laundered money for dictators and crime bosses all over the world. The bank the CIA itself called the Bank of Crooks and Thieves. That's a story for a future episode. Thanks for watching History Lessons, my friends. And as they say, see you next time.